Hello and welcome to Fantastic Fights, the podcast about a middle-aged man playing adventure game books out loud on the internet. This episode sees us tackle Siege of Sardath, the 49th book in the Fighting Fantasy series. This one's from 1992 and it was written by Keith P Phillips and illustrated by Pete Knifton. The cover art was by Les Edwards. Before we get into that, I've got the pleasant duty to thank a new patron, a kind soul who has gone to patreon.com/HJDoom and pledged as little as a single English pound to support my nonsense. Richard George, thank you so much for your support. There's a whole host of gaming nonsense available by way of a thank you, with more to come in the not too distant future. Now on with the show! Siege of Sardath is not a book I remember at all. Looking at the cover, it's not especially encouraging. We've got an evil-looking fellow with a pronounced widow's peak and some very fancy clothes glowering at us in front of a distant castle. He looks a bit like a vampire, but more like someone who takes Halloween a bit too seriously, wearing a somewhat expensive vampire costume. He looks like he might have come straight from a goth gig where he's been standing uncomfortably close to women about a third of his age. He's got an arm raised and he's sort of pointing, possibly in the act of casting an evil spell, but honestly it looks like he's trying to catch the attention of a bartender in a busy pub. It's a perfectly serviceably rendered illustration. Les Edwards could do this sort of thing in his sleep, and possibly on this occasion he actually did. The plot concerns some ancient evil rising up in the Forest of the Night and a desperate mission to find out what has happened to the city of Sardath. I've got an idea what might have happened to Sardath in this book called Siege of Sardath, and if it turns out we get there and it's not under siege, then honestly I am going to kick off. Of course, there's no guarantee that we'll even make it to Sardath at all. We've certainly seen books where the authors seem to forget the premise they'd decided on at the start by the time they got to the end of the writing process. The writer, Keith P Phillips, is a completely unknown quantity to me. He's almost a ghost in the historical record. There's an Australian photography book from the 1960s credited to a Keith P Phillips, but I've no idea whether or not it's the same person. One possibility is that Keith P Phillips is a pseudonym for someone in the gaming sphere, but it's also possible that Keith just submitted a book to Puffin and they liked it enough to publish it, and having scratched his creative itch, he just got on with his life. This being his sole credit in the Fighting Fantasy series, it's going to be interesting to see what he does with it. Most authors seem to need a book or two to really get a grip on the gamebook process. Phillips won't get that opportunity. His entire output will rest on how he delivers this first book. The artist Pete Knifton did the internal art for Tower of Destruction, and his contributions there were a thoroughly mixed bag. Will he hit the mark this time? I do hope so. Okay, let's take a look at the rules. We've got skill, stamina and luck all present and correct. There's reference in the stamina section to healing through the use of herb lore. This appears to replace provisions, which is a shame, but I like that it ties into the forest setting of the adventure. Every bundle of herbs will heal 4 stamina, just like a cheese and pickle sandwich would. The core rules also make mention of potions of skill, stamina and luck, which we haven't seen in A Dog's Age. We don't start with any potions, but it's nice to know that they might be out there. There is a small change to the combat rules because we start with an elven bow and a quiver containing 6 arrows. At various points we'll get to shoot our bow before engaging in combat. This is a straightforward skill test with a successful hit dealing 2 stamina points of damage. We might have time to fire only 1 arrow, or we might get to fire several. This system seems to work fine on paper, though I feel as though the arrows should probably do more damage. Chipping away at stamina feels okay for hand-to-hand combat. You can see it representing scratches and waning energy, but it never sits quite as well with me when it comes to ranged fighting, because it always feels as though arrows and bullets and what have you should be a bit more impactful, especially for monsters and bad guys. Still, it's simple, and deciding whether to use my limited supply of arrows sounds like a fun premise, so I'll give it a pass. I mean, it's unlikely to seriously break the game in any way, shape or form. So on that basis, I'm happy to give it a go and see how it pans out. Oh, you can also test your luck to reverse a miss with an arrow, which is, I think, a pleasant little way of applying the luck rules to ranged combat. My heart sank a little on discovering that there's a time mechanic in this book, but then it rose again when I realised it's based on days, which always feel like the most reasonable end of the time spectrum to track. There is a maximum of 7 days available, and they all have fantasy names like Storm's Day, Moon Day, and Not Getting Dressed Until Lunchtime Day. We start with some decent kit: a sword, our leather armour, a bow, 6 arrows, 5 bundles of herbs, and 15 gold pieces. We also have a ring showing that we are a member of the Grimmond Council, which is apparently a big deal. I'm a member of my parochial church council, and they've never given me a ring or a sword, and I'm starting to think I've been hard done by. I have generated a character for this adventure who I've decided to call Confi Equity, because I believe that sounds suitably heroic. They have a skill of 9, a stamina of 21, and a luck of 11, all of which were rolled 100% honestly. Let's play Siege of Sardath. A curious messenger. The cold air stings your throat as you desperately draw it into your lungs. The forest trail streaks past beneath your thundering feet. When you look over your shoulder, all you can see are the malevolent fir trees and the dark forest closing in behind you. So you run even harder to get away. Suddenly the trees are gone, and you find yourself standing before a huge, isolated mountain. As you watch, a great fissure opens up in its side, and darkness pours from within, staining the snow with its evil. Slowly, the gloom forms itself into an army of jet-black soldiers who surge towards you. The blinking of an eye, you are engulfed. You awake with a start, dispelling the nightmare. A council messenger is standing over you. "I am sorry to have woken you up," he says. "A traveller has just arrived and Grissa has called an emergency council meeting." So mysterious dreams that I think kind of tell us the entire plot that we're going to be investigating. Bad things in the forest, they've come out of a mountain. You could almost just leave the intro there and get on with it, but of course they don't. A short time later, you take your place in the council chamber of the Grimmond Town Hall. Grissa, the council leader, stands up. "This," she says, indicating a rather travel-worn man sitting beside her, "is Morn Preela, an adventurer from Zengis. He has informed me that our fears are true. It is the forest which has cut us off from Sardath. All those trying to get through have either been forced to turn back or have died in the attempt." And with that, Grissa sits down. Morn Preela rises to explain. "The wood elves have had to abandon the elf paths because they have been invaded by trees and spanned by the webs of giant spiders. Due to the spawning of all manner of horrific monsters and the rising of the Slake armies, killing indiscriminately, the river has become impassable." Grissa stands up again. "I think it is clear that the only way to protect ourselves is to fight this evil in any way we can, even if it means burning some of the forest." "You cannot do this!" you shout in sudden anger. Everyone looks at you in surprise. "I have travelled the forest all my life. It is a dark and fearsome place. The paths are kept open by hard work and diligence alone. But it is a place kept in balance. It is no good declaring war on the forest. Have you forgotten that it supplies you with your livelihoods? You should regard it as your friend." Berend, one of the oldest councillors, looks at you bitterly, his mouth twisted from the after-effects of spider poison. You remain undaunted. "Even the giant spiders and the troublesome slick are part of that balance. Do you think for one moment that the slick would cut off the river when our trading boats are their primary source of weapons and luxuries from the west? "What do you say has happened then?" shouts Tharbon. "It is a new and much darker enemy that threatens us. I am not yet sure what it is, but I do know that it is neither the forest nor any of its inhabitants. We have lived in the forest for centuries, and we have ourselves become part of the balance. The wood elves and people like Colrin and myself have made sure of that." You pause. "No, something alien to this part of Alanzia is doing this." I know I'm supposed to be the hero, but I'm finding myself a little bit on the sanctimonious side, I have to confess. Not sure that I want to spend that much time with myself, which is a problem. "I think you are deluding yourself with these ideas of a dark enemy," says Grissa. "We all know how much you love the forest. Perhaps this love is clouding your judgment. If you had heard Morn's story, you would understand." "If I may," says Morn Preela to Grissa, "I think it would be fruitful for me to tell my story to the Honourable Counsellor. As a fellow adventurer, I believe he would understand what I have seen." When Grissa hesitates, he continues, "Perhaps it would save the council time if I were to brief the counsellor in another room." "An excellent idea," says Grissa. She looks at you and gestures towards the door. Somewhat sullenly, you ask Morn to follow you. He picks up his pack, slings it across his back, and respectfully takes his leave of the council. You lead him along the empty corridors and up 2 flights of stairs to the council recess chamber. Opposite the door is a large window. It is dark outside, and when Morn sees his reflection, he flinches. You shrug inwardly and sit down on one of the comfortable chairs. Your pack is virtually empty, so you don't bother to take it off. Your bow and arrows are a little bulky, however, so you unsling them and put them down beside the chair. "Now then, Morn," you say, "let's hear your story." "It's quite simple," he says, sliding across to you. "When I was travelling in the forest, I was accosted and killed by a powerful creature. He then assumed my form and came here in order to kill the only person left in the forest who had any chance of thwarting the plans of his people." Now that is the end of the introduction, and great twist at the outset. Really like it. There's a few fun things going on there. One is that we're the ones who believe the land is in terrible peril and it's not just the forest, whereas usually it's some irritating old wizard who comes up with that. Secondly, I'm amused by the idea that there's anyone in Alanzia who doesn't immediately think, oh, an ancient evil has arisen, when the slightest thing goes wrong, because ancient evils arising in Alanzia is just what happens. Oh, Milkman's late again. Must be an ancient evil arisen from the tombs of the dead. Still, let us continue with the adventure proper. You sit there for a moment, stunned and bewildered by what Morn has just said. It is only when he grabs your left wrist and tears off the council ring from your finger that you realise you are in danger. Not the smartest cookie, it turns out. You leap to your feet, but Morn jumps backwards out of your way. "And now that I have your council ring," he says, "I will be able to impersonate you and persuade the Grimmond Council to take the people into the forest where they will surely die." You edge towards him cautiously, not sure what magic he is armed with. As you do so, a sinister transformation takes place. The back of his tunic bulges, then tears as 2 huge bat wings burst forth. He stretches them wide and takes a step forward, holding up his arms as if calling on a great power. Slowly, they change to a jet black colour, his hands becoming fierce talons. "On your own, you might have made it through the forest alive, armed as you are with knowledge and wit. But now it is too late." He reaches out to attack you. Will you draw your sword and fight him or dodge out of his way? Well, I guess I want my ring back, so I'm going to fight him. There is a picture of the shapeshiftery demony thing. Yeah, it's fine. It's kind of standing in a very static pose, sort of arms outstretched, like he's about to do a big star jump. It's okay. So let's see what his fighting ability is like. Die then, human, says the mutating creature, and seal the fate for all your race. So, Morn Preela has a skill of 7 and a stamina of 8. Whenever he loses an attack round, we need to roll 2 dice, and if the total is less than his current stamina, he continues the fight. If it's greater, then you roll 1 die. If that's greater than his stamina, then we turn to one paragraph. If that second die roll is less than his stamina, then we turn to a different paragraph. So that's kind of interesting. I think Mr. Preela is going to try and rabbit the second it looks like the fight's going against him, which I honestly wish happened more often in fighting fantasy books. Most people won't fight to the death. Anyway, skill 7, stamina 8. I'm going to roll some dice. I fought him for precisely 1 combat round, dealing 2 damage to him. Then I rolled 2 dice. It was higher than his remaining stamina, and I rolled 1 die, and it was lower than his remaining stamina, so we need to find out what happens. Your sword slices into Morn's side and he staggers backwards. You move towards him again and raise your sword to strike him. However, instead of slashing at you with his talons, he makes a dive for you. Roll 2 dice. Is the total greater than your skill or less than your skill? It is less than my skill. So I see the attack coming and manage to dodge nimbly out of the way. He turns and raises his talons. So we return to previous paragraph and continue the fight. Okay, I have reduced Morn Preela to 2 stamina points, and he has reduced me to 15 stamina points. He got pretty lucky in some of his rolls. Then I rolled the 2 dice and inevitably got over 2. Then I rolled 1 die and got over his remaining stamina of 2. So the other thing that can happen in the fight now happens. Your sword slashes into Morn's side, sending him staggering backwards. You advance on him, but now instead of fighting back, he makes a run for the recessed chamber window. Do you want to let him escape? Or would you prefer to dive after him and attempt to bring him to the ground? Or I can swipe at him with my sword, which will very easily hit him since he's not defending himself. And he's only got 2 stamina left. So yes, I'll just stab him as he makes a run for it. I'm not worried about fighting fair, I have to say. It does note that you can use luck to increase this, so if he had bolted on 4 stamina, which is not impossible, you could try and test your luck to finish him off with 1 blow, which is pretty cool. Pretty cool, I like that a lot. It's a really, really good opening fight, I have to say. Some really clever little twists to make it more interesting, and it's got a narrative to it, which you don't always get with fighting fantasy fights. Anyway, I have murdered the shape-shifting Morn Preela. Now that he is dead, you look at the body of the mutated imposter. In some ways it is familiar, like a dark elf perhaps. In others, it is like nothing you have ever seen. You retrieve your council ring and then search through his belongings. His pack contains 5 gold pieces, gold now 20, and 3 small bottles. They are labelled 1. Dried chameleonite blood, 2. Condensed mist from the Mithria forest, and 7. Pickled whole shape-changer brain. They are clearly components of some magical process, but you don't know what. You pick up your bow and arrows and return to the council chamber. So, let's make a note of those. I'm guessing that I'm going to be asked to do some basic arithmetic of some description with these items in order to unlock a hidden paragraph. Let's go and have a look at the old council chamber then. Grissa reconvenes the council to discuss what you are going to do. The councillors listen in a respectful silence when you tell them about the impostor. Now you have no choice but to believe in my dark enemy. I would love to march through the forest with an army and wipe this enemy out, but Morn told me himself that this is precisely what he came here to achieve. The forest is now so contaminated with evil that we would never make it through. The council members accept your plan to go alone, but insist that you wait for daylight and use the few remaining hours of darkness to recuperate. Grissa sends you some food and a healer to tend any wounds you may have. You may regain up to 6 stamina. Stamina now 21. Once the sun is up, tick off the first day on your adventure sheet. You gather together your equipment and leave the council hall. So we're now on Storm's Day. Most of the councillors have gone to their beds after all-night discussions, but Grissa is there to see you off. She gives you a 4-leaf clover. For luck, she says. You thank her and say farewell. Do you want to visit the town astrologer before leaving Grimmond? Yeah, why not? Yeah, sure. Really hoping he kind of tells me something like, yeah, today's a good day for starting new prospects. Look out for a tall, dark stranger. That kind of nonsense. Even though he is quite old, Liam Astronomicus, the astrologer, is a friend of yours, having helped you on many of your adventures. When Liam opens his oaken door to your knocking, he smiles. We thought you'd be paying me a visit. Come in. Once inside, the astrologer asks you to sit down. He sits opposite you and indicates his star charts. I've been working on this all night, but I'm still unable to tell you anything about this mission. I've studied the charts as closely as I can, but there's some cloud hanging over your future. Either that, a flicker of self-doubt passes across his face, or there's some power interfering with my activities. Then he smiles strangely. But there is something I haven't tried. It's a powerful but dangerous ritual, especially if the gods are not with you. No non-magician has ever seen it and lived. Do you insist that you must witness the ritual, or will you take the astrologer's advice and let him enter the spell chamber alone? There's a bit of me that's thinking this is another shape changer trying to do an evil spell on me while I'm not looking at him. But if you go and visit an expert, you should generally take their advice. Obviously in the real world, and you go and visit an astrologer, don't take their advice. They don't know what they're talking about. But yeah, I will take the astrologer's advice and let him enter the spell chamber alone, because whatever he does, I'll deal with that if it turns out to be bad. When the astrologer finally emerges, it is with a look of puzzlement on his face. Eagerly you ask him what happened. I was visited by Asuma, a messenger from the gods, and he had a message for you. He frowns in concentration. You're to look for the tomb of Cornu Witch in the Forest of the Night. You must look for the flyers. Without the amulet, you're lost. You look at him questioningly. I'm afraid I've got no idea what the Suna's advice means, but I'm sure it'll become clear in the fullness of time. He smiles. Anyway, it's time you were off. At the door, Liam wishes you good luck and waves you off as you walk down the main road. You walk to the outskirts of the village, trying to decide which route to take to the forest. Even though you have seen the enemy, you still know neither what it is nor where it comes from. As you come to the beginning of the forest trail, your reverie is broken by the clattering wheels of a wagon rattling along the road towards you. This is curious. You thought the forest had become impassable. As he approaches, the driver of the wagon shouts to you. Good morning, traveller. Are you interested in buying any of my potions and magical cure-alls? Are you suspicious of the trader? It might be wise to try a surprise attack on him. Otherwise, you must make some reply. Am I interested in buying potions or not? I think I probably am. I'll ask him what he's got and how much it costs. I don't think I'm going to stab every person that comes by. It's possible that he's got a potion that helped him get through the forest, for example. I have a great range of potions, he tells you, although some are limited in supply. He reaches into the wagon and produces a placard with a list of prices. The love potions are excellent value and very effective, though I don't suppose you are needing any such things. The sleeping draught is potent, but it does tend to make you a bit hyperactive once it's worn off. And then there are my special commodities. I'm afraid that the last 4 items on the list are very rare. I only have enough for 1 each. I suppose I ought to apologise for their cost as well, but as I said, they are very special. So there's a picture of the potion vendor who sells a total of 5 different love potions of varying strengths and varying prices. So you can buy some snapperfish oil, some sleeping draught, and then there's the potion of fortune, the potion of strength, dried chameleonite blood, Pegasus feathers. I feel as though the Pegasus feathers, because it's got a number attached to it, is the one I should go for, and that's 16 gold pieces, which I can afford. So I'm going to spend 16 of my 20 gold pieces on 6 Pegasus feathers. That's the old fighting fantasy instincts kicking in there. You see something with a number stapled to it and you think, oh, I must have that. After making your purchase, you bid the man farewell and carry on down the road. Do I want the snapperfish oil as well? No, I'll leave the snapperfish oil. There's always one item that's just there to distract you. I do hope the love potions don't turn out to be incredibly useful. You walk on down the road until you come to the last outpost of the village, the harbour where all the trading boats are kept. It has a look of dereliction about it. All the sails are furled, the food in the warehouses is beginning to rot. The scene drives home to you the importance of your mission and the urgency with which it must be completed. There is not much for you to go on yet, but nevertheless you must now decide how you will proceed. Will you travel northeast on the Grim Way, take your boat and sail up the river, or cross the river and head northwest through the forest? They all seem like reasonable options, but I'm going to cross the river and head northwest through the forest because looking at the map, that's the bit that's labelled as Forest of the Night, and that's where we were told to search for the Tomb of Corno Witch. The river acts as a defence against the giant orb-webbed spiders that live in the forest to the west. They are the reason that the Grimway takes such a roundabout route. Having decided to brave the more direct route where there is no bridge, you untie your small boat and row across the river. Once across, you set it adrift. Spiders can't row, but you don't yet know what other dangers have arisen. As you walk through the forest, more eyes seem to be peering at you from the dark spaces between the trees than you remember, and the background noise of unknown creatures is louder. Everywhere, there are the webs of giant spiders. Fortunately, this species is a trapper rather than a hunter, so you are safe as long as you apply all your skills to avoiding the almost invisible webs. It's doing a great job of selling me on the idea that I am a skilled ranger type. I really do feel like a ranger in this adventure, and it's done it without mechanically massively harping on at it. It's just done it through the way in which the adventure is being presented. Like blundering into a spider's web is a real classic bit of adventure fiction nonsense. A great way to have a spider encounter. But here it's making a point that actually people who know what they're doing, people who are familiar with the forest, they can avoid these kind of traps. After you've been walking for several hours, you hear something running towards you. It is large and has many legs. But it can't be a giant spider, for they seldom leave their webs. Then you see it charging through the trees, a giant stag beetle with an enormous black armoured body and hugely overgrown jaws like a stag's antlers. But it's so much more ferocious than any stag. Will you dodge out of the way, shoot at it, or fight it with your sword? Well, I don't think stag beetles have much in the way of treasure as a rule, so I'm going to dodge out of the way and just let it get on with whatever very important giant stag beetle business it's got going on. I get the impression that it's late to the stag beetle office or whatever. So yeah, we're going to dodge the stag beetle. In order to dodge the beetle, your timing must be perfect. Write down a number between 1 and 6. This represents the time at which you decide to jump. Now roll 1 die. This represents the time at which the beetle would hit you. If your guess is exactly right or is only 1 lower or higher than the beetle's number, then you're fine. Now, if you guess less than the beetle's number, you jump too early, which will deal 1 point of damage. If it's 2 or more higher than the beetle's number, you jump too late, and the beetle hits you in the middle. If it hits you, it skids to a halt and turns to charge again, and you get another chance to do the dodge minigame. I feel like 5 is the smart choice, because that means I succeed in dodging on a 4, 5 or 6, and on a 1 to 3 I only take 1 point of damage. So we choose a 5 and we roll a 6, so I have successfully dodged the beetle. Just as the beetle reaches you, you leap out of its way. Unable to change direction, it goes thundering past you straight into the web of a giant spider. With lightning speed, the spider scuttles down its web and attacks the writhing creature. Within seconds, it is still. The spider clamps its jaws around the body and hauls it high up into the tree, where you can see it wrapping the beetle in silk to be hung for eating later on. So that's grisly, but pretty cool. Lovely little minigame, like it a lot. You rest for a few moments, perhaps treating yourself with some of your herbs. Then you set off again. After a couple of hours steady walking, you catch a glint of light coming from the trees ahead. As you approach, you can see that the sun is striking something in the base of a strange shrub. The shrub is about 3 meters tall, with a wide, thick-barreled trunk and palm-like fronds interspersed with yellow star-shaped flowers. As you get closer, you can see that it is a sword entangled in its roots that is glinting. Do you want to try and get the weapon out, or would you prefer to leave it and carry on northwest? And if we carry on northwest, we can go straight on to the fork in the road where the elf village is hidden. There is a picture of the sword and the frondy shrub. It looks pretty sinister. It looks very sinister. And I feel as though this is an obvious trap. But the sword does look very shiny, and I would quite like a magic sword. So I am going to risk yanking the weapon out, because of course I am. There was no chance I was going to do anything else, was there? If I have a motto in these games, it is very much embrace the stupid. So we're instructed to roll 2 dice. Is the total less than equal to your skill? I roll a 7, so yes it is. As you approach, you recognise the flowers as those of the Death Dripper, a highly dangerous carnivorous plant. If you were to touch its roots, the flowers would drip a fast-acting contact poison onto you, a risk you cannot afford to take. You turn your back on the plant and keep on walking northwest, thanking the teachings of Sorrel, our elf friend, for saving your life. Obviously, the former owner of the sword was not so fortunate. Some hours later, as the sun is beginning to set, you approach the fork in the road where the elf village is hidden among the trees. So, lucky escape there. It's a great choice to use the skill system to represent more than just your fighting ability, but also to kind of tie it into your ranger skills as well. That works really nicely. And the temptation to create another stat to cover woodsmanship and bushcraft must have been strong, but the author has resisted on the basis that you can use skill for that perfectly well. I think that's probably the right call, to be honest. That said, I wouldn't be massively upset if there had been a kind of bushcraft woodsmanship skill in there as well. That would also have been very thematically appropriate, but only if it were going to be used enough to justify it. And if you decide that you're going to fold that into the skill stat, you don't have to worry about how often you're using it at all, which is a weight off your mind if you're a game designer. So yeah, just really, really good, parsimonious, Game design there, like it a lot. You stop and wait, knowing that the elves must be aware of your presence and that they will come to greet you in their own good time. Very few humans have had much contact with the elf village, and you are the only one ever to have been trained by an elf. When you and adventurers like you were trying to open up the elf paths, Sorrel, whose elven name is Eldorn Fellerstein, befriended you and taught you not to fear the forest but to understand and respect it. He also showed you how to use a bow, how to best track, and how to heal yourself using herbs and mosses. In return, you taught him swordplay. The scar across his right eye is testimony to this. As you stand there, thinking of your old friend, a small band of elves steps out of the tree with Sorrel at their head. You raise your hand in greeting and move to approach. "Hold!" shouts Sorrel. "Go no further, impostor. We know who you are." You stand there for a second, baffled. Sorrel lifts his hand and the elves raise their bows. You must act quickly or die. Will you shoot Sorrel, try to prove who you are, or turn and run? There is a picture of Sorrel and his elf mates, all looking about as naff as elves always look. There is, however, an important detail in the artwork, which is that unless I've got my right and my left confused, which does sometimes happen, Sorrel's scar is actually on his left eye, not his right, indicating that this is not Sorrel, this is some shape-shifting imposter. So, can I prove who I am? I think with that information, I can prove who I am. So that's what I'm going to try and do. Or should I just shoot him? If I shoot him, is he going to turn back into the creature that he was? No, I'm going to try and prove who I am. You mentioned something that only you and he know, some secret from your time together. Makes it sound as though the secret is a very naughty secret. Instead of the expected flicker of recognition, he gives you a blank look followed by one of grim determination. "Shoot," he orders, and 4 arrows fly from the elves. Test your luck. So if we're unlucky, at least one of the arrows pierces your heart, killing you instantly. So let's hope we're lucky. 4. Yep, absolutely I'm lucky. If you are lucky, the elves have some doubt about Sorrel's verdict concerning your identity. They cannot disobey an order, but they can aim their shots at less vulnerable parts of your body. Oh, cheers. Thank you so much for just shooting me in the knee. I lose 2 stamina to the elves' incredibly philanthropic attempt to not quite murder me. So I guess now I should have shot him. I kind of knew I should have shot him. But that's what I'm going to do now. Before the elves have time to react, you draw your bow and fire an arrow at Sorrel. I kind of need this to hit, and I've missed by 1, which is very aggravating. So I will test my luck. My luck that's now 10 to try and change the miss into a hit, which I do successfully. My luck is now 9. The very instant your arrow hits Sorrel, he lets out a horrific, piercing scream. His scar vanishes and his skin darkens to an inky black colour. One of the elves shouts, "Dark Elf!" and they all attack him. In seconds, the creature is dead. When the excitement has died down, Bistort, an elf commander, explains, "Dark Elves have somehow acquired the ability to assume any form they wish. I'm afraid that rather than looking after the paths, we have spent all our energy in seeking them out and destroying them. Dark Elves are our oldest and most despised enemy." He laughs hollowly. "We nearly killed you because we thought you were one." Bistort hands you a 7-coiled snake ring. "Please accept this token with our apologies for misjudging you." Suddenly, a shout comes from the tall lookout tree above you, and you both climb up. From the forest treetops you can make out 2 black shapes silhouetted against the night sky, flying southwest. Eventually they swoop down somewhere to the east of the village. "Sorrel was in charge of tracking the black flyers," Bistort informs you. "He said that he had seen them and that they were not dark elves. That was clearly a lie, and I will dispatch a tracking party at once. Do you want to track them yourself? Or do you want to stay in Ashcleve for the night? I'm curious about the dark flyers, the black flyers. I should note down that I've got that ring. I'm not massively inclined to go out of my way to help elves in general, but in particular elves who think that the way to deal with an illegal order to murder someone is to go, I won't quite murder them. That's morally fine. And so yeah, I'm going to stay in Ashcleve for the night. Sort out their own black flyers. This steward arranges for you to be lodged in the guardhouse in the lookout tree, and after an excellent supper of elven delicacies you settle down to sleep. In the morning you regain 2 stamina points and tick off the next day on your adventure sheet. So we're now on Moon Day. Bistort returns to wake you. He tells you that his confidence is high, although his tracking party hasn't returned yet. Even though they're a problem to everybody, he says, the Dark Elves are our responsibility, especially in the forest. We were searching for the entrance to their underground city, although it may not be here. Could be beneath the lake or the mountains. So I suggest you leave the forest to us and continue your search northwards. You tell him about your strange nightmare, saying that it seemed to point to the city being beneath the mountains. I'm not sure that it's safe to trust to dreams in these strange times, he says, unless you know what their source is. Nonetheless, it is a possibility. Before you leave, Bistort replenishes your supply of arrows and gives you 3 bundles of herbs. So we're now up to 8 bundles of herbs, and we are back up to 6 arrows. Will you go northwest on the Elf Pass, north through the forest, or northeast along the other Elf Pass? No, I think we're going to go northwest on the Elf Pass. We'll try and take the route that takes us through the majority of the forest. You walk along the badly overgrown path for several hours, keeping a lookout for giant spiders. Suddenly, test your luck. Yeah, I make it, which is good because the text informs me that failing to test my luck leads to an instant death. I think is my main criticism of this book so far. I mean, I know that I am deliberately walking through Spider Central, despite having been warned that it was Spider Central, so can't massively complain about instant death by spider as a thing. But, yeah, I'm just not a fan of the instant luck test or die, unless it's a moment of really high drama where it feels earned. Because I'm lucky, we go and see the spider before it drops, and just have time to dodge out of its way. It hangs over the path on a single thread, its myriad eyes staring at you and its huge jaws clicking. When you draw your sword, however, it scuttles nervously back up into the tree. You skirt round it and walk on. Many hours later, as evening is approaching, you decide to stop and make camp, so you shake out your blankets, eat a little food, and settle down to sleep. Neither the track nor the forest has any ground cover, so your bed is rough and cold. You don't get much sleep, lose 1 point of stamina. In the blue pre-dawn, tick off the next day on your adventure sheet, so we're now up to Fire Day. In the blue pre-dawn, you are awoken by the sound of something coming through the trees. When it appears, you instantly recognise the giant wolf spider, a webless predator much fiercer than the wolf it is named after. It moves towards you on its long, thin legs, its huge mandibles clicking hungrily. There is just time to fire 1 arrow at it if you want to. So, the giant wolf spider has a skill of 9 and a stamina of 8. I'm going to shoot an arrow at it successfully, reducing it to a stamina of 6. So, I'm going to roll some dice. I have defeated the giant wolf spider. If you win, you break camp and set off, eating a little breakfast as you go. The trees loom large over the elf path, and it grows ever darker until you can hardly see the sun. Towards midday, the path leaves the forest and you are relieved to follow it. However, As you walk north on the Zengis Road, you gradually realise that the nightmare is far from over. For there is a terrible blackness hanging over Lake Sardmere. Will you carry on northwards into the mountains or travel along the road to Sardath? We'll travel along the road to Sardath because I want to see if it's under siege. Sardath, built on stilts over Lake Sardmere, is the trading centre of the Freeze-Blood Mountains and the Forest of Night. Built centuries ago by the rough men and dwarves who came to this region to exploit its many resources, Sardath has become an important outpost in the spread of civilization through northern Alansia. As you walk along the road, the whole of Lake Sardmere is shrouded by a strange swirling storm, with the town at its centre. From what you can see, Sardath itself looks completely dead. The bridge that crosses the lake has been destroyed and most of the boats have been wrecked. Is today Fire Day or Earth Day? It is Fire Day. There is a picture of Sardath. It's pretty good, actually. Yeah, not bad. You can see the clouds and the bridge that sort of collapsed into the lake and the waves being tossed by the storm. I guess a storm is almost like a siege. Thematically, it's a siege. It's not a proper siege. I wanted an army. I wanted camps and siege engines and all the rest of it. This isn't a proper siege. I'm quite cross. But yes, today is Fire Day. There is still cause for hope. A small sailing boat struggling desperately against the weather. Its lone sailor dashing frantically from sail to tiller and back again may not make it. You look around for a means to aid him, but the only thing you can find that will actually float is a small rowing boat moored to the wrecked bridge. Will you row out and help the sailor, or hope that he makes it on his own? I'm going to row out and help. Hopefully the sailor can tell me a story of how Sardath was besieged until yesterday, at which point the siege stopped. And thus I'll get the siege that I want. I'm harping on about this. I should stop. Roll 2 dice, deduct 3 from the total, and compare that to your skill. So I roll a 4, that's a 1. So that is definitely less than my skill. Doesn't seem especially deadly so far. The odd murderous luck test aside, doesn't seem especially deadly so far, this book. The waves crash around you and the wind and rain lash into your face. You are only just able to reach the sailing boat. "Brave, help!" comes a shout from above. When you look up, you see a woman throwing you a rope, so you grab it and haul the rowing boat alongside. Once you are aboard, the woman starts giving you orders. Realising that she is an experienced sailor, you jump to it, and with your help she is able to get the boat to shore. "I am Nea," she reveals once you are both safe. "I owe you my thanks." You try and shrug off her thanks, but cannot suppress a good feeling about what you did. Regain 1 luck point. Luck now 9. "They all said I was foolish to try and escape from the town, especially now the storm has grown so bad. Perhaps I should have tried to get away earlier, but we all wanted to stay to defend Sardath from the Black Flyers." When you tell her that you are the very enemy you have come to destroy, her face lights up with hope. "Then you must travel north into the mountains, for that is where they come from. Strangely though, on the first night of the siege it was a Dark Elf army that destroyed the bridge and sank our boats. And there is a connection between these two forces, but it is too frightening to contemplate. And I'm delighted that there was an actual honest-to-goodness siege that happened at Sardath. Hooray, that makes me happy." Okay, I don't have the brass key, so... "Corianthus should know what's going on," she says. "He knows much of what's going on in these mountains." You ask her who he is. "Corianthus is the storm giant, who lives in the castle on Hurn Cloud." She reaches inside her tunic and produces a large brass key. "This is one of the keys to his library. Sign of his special trust. Take it to Corianthus and ask for his help in my name." You thank her and ask how you can get to the giant. "Go north," she says. following the river until you reach a small stream leading up the side of a huge isolated mountain. Persevere and you'll reach the castle. You thank Nea again. I would like to travel with you, she says, but I have already promised to go to Fangthane, the dwarven capital, to tell them of our plight. Sardath has a huge dwarven population, so they are sure to come to our aid, if it's not too late. You wish her luck. She smiles. I will see you when I come back to Sardath to celebrate the success of your mission. You laugh at her bravado and watch as she heads towards Gwynir's bridge. Once Nea is out of sight, you turn north and begin the trek into the mountains. Going suspiciously well, this adventure. The Freezeblood Wall is too steep and treacherous a set of mountains for you to climb, so you must skirt round its eastern edge. After travelling for some distance, you observe a black shape at the foot of one of the numerous rocky crags. It is not so far away, so you climb up to investigate. When you get there, you find that the shape is, in fact, the corpse of a dark elf which has been dead for at least a week. The creature seems to have been stripped of its weapons and armour, and it was not carrying a pack. Nevertheless, a thorough investigation is always worthwhile. Roll 2 dice. Add together the numbers rolled, then modify the result depending on what day it is. So we are on Fire Day, which means we deduct 2. And the result needs to be less than our skill. Skill of 9 minus 2 would be, we need 8 or less. And we get a 6. That's fine. Even though you find nothing on the Dark Elf's body, you do discover a number of footprints nearby. You follow them eastwards for a short distance until you come to an area containing several other tracks, all leading northwest up a long valley. These prints were made over a week ago and by large numbers. A Dark Elf army, perhaps? The presence of such a force, no matter how long ago, is a vital clue to your mission, so you waste no time in following it up. Really enjoying how well integrated the time mechanic is. Seems to make a small but measurable difference to how things go, and the way in which the passage of time has been thought about is also, it feels very realistic to me. The idea that if you spend too long travelling, then the trail from this dark elf will have degraded considerably and be much more difficult to spot. So yeah, very, very clever. You travel all day through the Freezeblood Mountains, following the same route up the long, gently rising valley. There is no path here, so the going is very difficult. You can see a huge, isolated mountain at the end of the valley, but it is impossible to tell how far away it is. You walk for many hours, and it doesn't seem to get any closer. To make matters worse, the valley floor is damp and marshy. You can only make progress by leaping between clumps of springy turf. Each misstep threatens to break your ankle, but you are not easily beaten, and you keep going, ignoring the sweat which is almost freezing against your skin. By the time night begins to fall, the mountain still doesn't look any nearer. But everything you've discovered indicates that this is the way you must go, so there is no point turning back now. Indeed, you may even decide to press on through the night. Do you want to do so, or do you want to camp for the night? I've got loads of stamina. I've got loads of herbs. What's better for a stab wound than some oregano? That's what I want to know. So yeah, I think we're going to just press on through the night. After you have been walking for an hour or so, you notice several black shapes silhouetted against the night sky some way ahead. You realise almost immediately that they are black flyers. There is nowhere for you to run to, but they are creatures of the night and saw you long before you saw them. As they swoop down towards you, you realise your adventure is over. So a sudden and unexpected death. I'm not going to invoke the sausagey-fingered bookmark rule. I've been recording for a little bit over an hour. I think that's plenty. Thoroughly enjoyable first run through this game book, I have to say. Covering a lot of ground, a lot going on, having a nice time with it. Obviously, I'm going to have another crack at it I didn't manage to find the Tomb of Cornu Witch, for example, which seems like a problem. Yeah, I'll have another crack. Several other cracks, if necessary. Then I will cogitate upon the game book as a whole and write some closing remarks and come back for you in just a couple of seconds. Tatty bye. The first thing I noticed when I was editing the recorded playthrough was that I'd been told in no uncertain terms that I needed to find the magic amulet, which I did sort of try to do, but also that I needed to investigate the flyers, which I decided not to do for reasons that aren't entirely clear in retrospect. In my defence, it requires quite a lot of mental energy to do all those silly voices, and it doesn't leave a great deal of spare brain power for remembering extremely obvious and useful clues. If you decide to play this gamebook, I can heartily recommend following the advice. It's really useful. I was also amused to discover that with my traditional unerring sense of the foolish, I'd set off in completely the wrong direction at the outset. Classic me. This is a book I enjoyed, but it's a book I really wish I'd played at a different time. It's something that doesn't get talked about enough when we discuss the process of reviewing, but the circumstances under which you encounter something have a real impact on how much you enjoy it. I haven't been sleeping especially well, and the hot weather has made me feel quite drained, and it didn't leave me in a mindset to really appreciate being challenged to the extent that Siege of Sardath challenges the player. When engaging with criticism, it's generally considered a good thing to aim for a degree of objectivity, but of course anyone who has a nodding acquaintance with how criticism works knows that that's actually impossible. In general, I think the best critics accept their subjectivity and attempt to interrogate it as part of the critical process. For example, I like the Ben Affleck Daredevil movie more than most, but I'm self-aware enough to realise that the presence of the extremely handsome Colin Farrell playing an unhinged villain has more than a little to do with my appreciation. I like both extremely attractive people and unhinged villains, in a way that has little to do with the actual quality of the work in which they appear. This is to illustrate that there's all sorts of personal quirks that go into how we receive art, and that's fine. What some people do, though, is try and elevate their personal preferences to some kind of objective standard. Perhaps my favourite example of this is objectivist lunatic Ayn Rand, who, aside from writing some of the most turgid novels ever committed to paper, also smoked like a chimney. Being Ayn Rand, she then came up with specious reasons to intellectually support her love of tobacco, claiming that people should smoke because a cigarette's glowing tip echoed the fire of reason and emphasised humanity's ability to dominate their environment by the creation of fire. What an absolute nutter. But all critics are guilty of this to a certain extent. We all create arguments to try and make the subjective appear as objective as possible. But interrogating subjectivity can also provide answers to interesting questions. When I finished Siege of Sardath, my first question was why I hadn't enjoyed it more. I love a complicated gamebook. I like gamebooks that are filled with meaningful choices. I like gamebooks with a defined structure that acts to create a sense of escalation. I like gamebooks with foreshadowing and clues to make it feel like the world is coherent. And I like books where different areas are linked by more than accidents of geography. Siege of Sardath has all these things, but my overriding feeling at the end was a sense of relief that it was done. There are some objective things I can point to, but honestly, I just think this is a book best experienced while full of vim and vigour, rather than in a mild and slightly sweaty fog of exhaustion. My overall impression is this book is really good, but perhaps a little exhausting even at the best of times. It is absolutely crammed with content. There's so much material in here. It's another one that feels like it's straining at the seams, somehow much longer and more involved than 400 paragraphs has any right to feel. You need to have your wits about you at all times, and making notes of various clues and hints as you go, as well as reading the text closely, will definitely help with subsequent attempts. Make no mistake, this book is really hard. It's kind of deceptive because as you're playing, it doesn't feel all that difficult in the moment. There's a smattering of hard fights and a sprinkling of instant deaths, but it's easy to feel as though you're making progress. but that progress is frequently an illusion. It's only as you get to the end phase of the book that it becomes clear that there's a lot you need to have done and done right before you get to the business end of things. This is something that's generally a good thing. I've long championed the idea that it's worth making getting to the end portions of a book fairly doable. Throwing constant roadblocks in the way of the player can make early attempts feel like a real slog. The downside to this is that if you put a bunch of progress checks in at the end, it can make going back and exploring feel a bit overwhelming, especially if you find another item, go all the way back through to the end and then find that immediately after that item check there's another one, and that means you're going to have to go back and start exploring a massive area all over again. If you have item checks scattered through the text, that makes it conceptually easier to divide the book into manageable chunks you need to explore in order to progress. Neither approach is wrong per se, but each comes with its own costs and its own benefits. While Siege of Sardath is rock hard, it doesn't feel particularly mean-spirited about it. There's plenty of helpful information doled out. It's fairly generous early doors in pointing you towards some key elements, but there is a whole bunch of stuff that is much more obtuse. It's a book with only one real path to victory, despite feeling quite open in the early stages. The map at the front is genuinely quite helpful. It gives a good impression of how the book is broadly structured, which I very much liked, but for me, there's just a little bit too much that's hidden well off the beaten track. There's a few puzzles in this book too. My feelings on puzzles are basically a study in hypocrisy. I consider puzzles fine if I'm able to solve them without much difficulty, and a massive imposition if I struggle. I do think that number puzzles risk breaking immersion, but I'm grudgingly forced to admit that the majority of the puzzles here feel quite appropriate and have been incorporated quite cleverly into the narrative. There is a number puzzle that controls a hidden door in the library, which is fine. I like a secret door with a unfathomably baroque opening mechanism. There's also a potion-making puzzle, which feels suitable for a fantasy story. The elephant in the room is a viciously difficult puzzle, which presents you with a series of 6 squares with abstract designs which need to be rearranged in order to unlock a clue to a hidden paragraph. It is fiendishly difficult, and I dislike anything that makes me feel stupid. I dislike a lot of things. The square puzzle is quite hard to even find, and it's not strictly required to win, although it does make things much, much easier, and if you've rolled a low skill it really might be the only way for you to win. So yeah, it's hard, but that's all I want to say about the difficulty, because in some ways the difficulty is the least interesting thing about the book. It should be easier than it is, but at least it's broadly fair. The setup is fairly uninteresting on the face of it, yet another traditional fantasy evil rising up in the mountains, but as always when it comes to genre tropes, the devil is in the details. It might be a standard setup, but there's lots of ways the author has managed to wring interest from the process. This starts right from the beginning with the Black Flyer disguised as an adventurer. It's a lovely little encounter that can play out in a whole bunch of different ways, depending on the dice and the choices that you make. Clichés are fine if you do something interesting with them, and Keith Phillips reliably finds something interesting in some core fantasy staples. A great example of this is the potion vendor. Not only does he manage to find a bit of sly humour in the stock character, by having most of his inventory be love potions at a variety of prices to suit any sufficiently gullible pocket, there's also a few different ways for the encounter to pan out, which makes it feel much deeper and more realistic. There's so many examples of this throughout the text. You can find your old friend in the forest and discover that he's been taken over by some evil mould. It's a great way to show how the forest has changed and become more dangerous, but there is also a way, admittedly a bit of a tricky way, to cure your friend if you've got the right kit, and he'll give you some valuable items and information if you can restore him to full health. Almost every encounter has some little twist that elevates it. Running into the Dark Elf pretending to be your old friend Sorrel is fun, especially since there's been a clue smuggled into the artwork, which is always a real treat. It's not just the narrative of the encounters, there's some good mechanical work here too. If you find the tomb of Cornu Witch, There's a ghost that needs avoiding in order to progress, which involves waiting until just the right moment to make a break for the exit. Even accessing the tomb feels very clever. With the right hints, it becomes clear that you need to do something kind of pointless on the face of it, and coming to the tomb once you've got the clue gives a nice moment of realisation as to why a slightly pointless seeming option is there in the first place. I also very much liked the beetle charging minigame. A simple D6 table would have been cleaner, but choosing a number is more involving, and being able to work out that there's an ideal number to choose is pleasant. It's a great example of a mechanic that makes thematic sense. Choosing exactly when to jump aside feels appropriate, but it's also got something more going on than just random chance. It shows how sometimes more complicated and even slightly clunky rules can be more engaging if they're the right mechanics for the situation being described. There's a fight with a pair of dark elves where one of them is really good at fighting and the other really isn't, and the text gives you a chance to shoot them with a couple of arrows. Using your arrows to soften up the better fighter is an obvious tactic, but it does make you feel smart and gives you a chance in a fight that would otherwise be very hard indeed. He manages to make the Dark Elf city feel exceptionally weird and unsettling. There's more than a hint of Michael Moorcock's Melniboné in the lair, and the description is backed up by an unpleasant but appropriate insanity mechanic. That kind of thing is always going to play well with me. Other favourites include a point where a dark elf is killed by a deadly fungus, but if you found a particular book earlier, you will know that that fungus only works on dark elves, which means that you are perfectly safe to go in and rummage through its pockets. Even though there's nothing on the surface that would be out of place in any of about 30 fighting fantasy books, there's an attention to detail that brings them to life in a fantastic way. There's a cavalcade of these details throughout the journey, and I really appreciated them. Oh, and the mirror demon from Death Trap Dungeon shows up. Love me a callback. In general, there's a lot of thought been put into the choices, but it does break down a little bit towards the end, when you're likely to be faced with more than a few left-right decisions that feel all the more unfair because you're aware that a single mistake is likely to be punished, and punished brutally. I suspect there's a bit of being pushed for space and maybe time by the end of writing the book, and not having the ability to create such complex encounters. It's also partly my preference for wilderness and urban environments for adventure as well. I'm just not the biggest dungeon fan in practice, although I do love them in theory. It does all come together very nicely in the finale though. It's another one which is a combination of item checks and decision making, with barely a dice roll in sight. There is one luck test, but he has cleverly written it so that you can win regardless of how it pans out, so long as you respond intelligently to the different options. Another thing I really like is how he's managed to make the protagonist feel as though they're a proper ranger, and done this without needing to create any additional systems. A combination of skill, tests, and simple honest-to-goodness writing makes you feel like you know the wilderness like the back of your hand. Obviously, a skill system is a perfect vector for this kind of thing, as we've seen in Way of the Tiger, but this is a welcome reminder that you can actually do things with good old-fashioned writing. It's probably the thing that stood out the most to me as a design lesson from this. Always ask yourself whether a thing needs bespoke mechanical support, or whether you can just present it through how you structure the text. It's something that Way of the Tiger often does well too, by the way. It's not just the skill system, but providing descriptions of things you do and the options you have available that reinforce that core fantasy. If you write stuff rather than systematise it, there's also the bonus that you can put in as much or as little as you like without setting player expectations in the same way. If you give someone a baking stat, they're going to expect to whip up a delicious Victoria sponge or two, and they will quite rightly feel shortchanged if you don't give them plenty of chances to audition for the Great Alansian Bake Off. But if you tell the player they used to be a baker and then baking crops up once in the story, that just feels like a nice surprise and a callback to the character's origins. If I'm being critical, there's a couple of points where Siege of Sardath feels like it's creaking under the weight of all the stuff Phillips is determined to cram into it. There's quite a lot of places where the outcomes of failed luck tests are specified in the same section as the outcome for passing the luck test. And I think it's generally better to send you to different sections for the different outcomes. Reading two versions of reality in the same section just isn't particularly good for immersion. There's also sections that could have used maybe an additional section to link them together. There's a couple of abrupt transitions, particularly where you can access a location from multiple different directions. These are both consequences of cramming so much content into 400 sections. There's just no space to spare. If this were 425 sections with the same content, it could have breathed a lot better. There's also one or two small errors in the text, and I spent quite a while trying to find out where you could learn the password to a magical door, only to discover on doing a bit of research that is not actually included in the text anywhere. I saw a couple of people online suggest that there's actually a way to work it out from the text, but none of these people actually specified what that way might be, so I have to take their claims with a pinch of salt. In general, though, the book is very solidly written. Phillips has an easy-to-read, clear and concise style that's perfect for writing game books. The artwork is also fine. It's not up there with the best fighting fantasy art, but it adds a pleasant visual dimension to the story, as always, and there's some points where additional information is conveyed by the artwork, which I reliably enjoy. The book has a clear sense of place, the larger environment makes sense, and it coheres together in a way that you don't always see. A lot of fighting fantasy books are a kind of list of fun but unconnected set pieces. This always feels as though everything is connected to everything else. It also feels like a part of a Lanzia rather than something made up out of whole cloth that's been dropped onto a map. The world of fighting fantasy is interesting in this regard. It's mostly a deliberately blank slate formed from generic role-playing stock images, but there's bits that feel very vibrant and very real, mostly the bits that Ian Livingstone came up with. The best locations of fighting fantasy generally have a slightly down-at-heel vibe, and that's certainly the case here. There might be a traditional evil looming in the mountains, but the forest and the town of Grimond and even the larger city of Sardath feel very low-key. This is a local apocalypse for local people, and that feels appropriate for the setting. I do have to say I was hoping for a bit more Sardath action and maybe a bit more of a siege. Although Siege of Sardath can't be accused of false advertising exactly, you can go to Sardath and there is an actual siege, but it's a peripheral element of the plot at best. As always, this is more forgivable in a book that's actually good, which is happily the case here. It's also a faintly useful distraction. Presenting the journey to Sardath as the framing device might be disingenuous, but it also allows the revelation of the final location of the action to come as a surprise, which wouldn't have been the case if it had been called Mountains of Malevolence or Peaks of Perfidy or whatever. I do think that not having Sardath on the path to victory is probably a mistake. In summary, though, this is a cracking book if you like a real challenge, and a perfectly good book if you can live with its extreme challenge. For me, it's a shame to think that this was the only one he contributed to the series. I gather he has popped up from time to time at Fighting Fantasy Fest, which is great to hear. There's some frustrations with Siege of Sardath for sure, but overall, I did enjoy my time with it a great deal. The good definitely outweighed the bad, and if I felt a bit drained when I actually finished it, I enjoyed going through the book and just finding little bits that I'd missed. That was a really nice time. I think I would have enjoyed it more in winter than summer. Winter feels like the ideal time to hunker down and really delve into something challenging, but the podcast demands what the podcast demands, so you get a slightly sleepy summer impression of the book instead. Oh well, such is life. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can do so by email at hjdoomretrofun, all one word, at gmail.com. It can sometimes take me a few days to respond, but I will always reply to emails sooner or later, and I do love receiving emails. Thanks to those who've been in touch to say they enjoyed a day in the life. The feedback has been much appreciated in this corner of the world. You can follow me on Blue Sky at HJDoom if you like, but it's very much an old man shouting at clouds over there. Oh, please do get in touch if there's things you would like me to cover. Next episode is a listener request, for example, and one that I'm very much looking forward to. I hope you will join me for that. In the meantime, thank you for listening, take care, and I'll see you soon.